In 1820, a whale did something no one had ever recorded in human history. It turned around and attacked the ship hunting it. The Essex sank in minutes. But the sinking wasn't the tragedy. What the 20 surviving sailors chose to do next, floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no land in sight, that is the part history tried to forget. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from doing something dangerous and surviving it repeatedly. By 1820, the whale ship Essex had made the journey before. Her crew knew the risks. They had signed on anyway. That tells you something about who these men were and about the world that produced them. The Essex departed Nantucket, Massachusetts on August 12, 1819. She was a mid-sized whale ship, 87 feet long, seasoned by years of ocean work. Her captain was George Pollard, Jr., just 28 years old, commanding his first major voyage. His first mate was Owen Chase, 22, sharp, experienced beyond his years, and quietly ambitious. Below them were 18 additional men, experienced sailors, green recruits, and everything in between. Most were from Nantucket. Several were African-American sailors, a common and largely unacknowledged presence in the 19th century whaling industry. All of them had one thing in common: they needed the money, and whaling was where the money was. Sperm whale oil in 1819 was among the most valuable commodities on Earth. It burned cleaner than any other fuel. It lubricated the machines of the Industrial Revolution. It lit the street lamps of cities from Boston to London. A successful voyage could fill a ship's hold with enough oil to make every man aboard relatively wealthy. An unsuccessful one meant months at sea for almost nothing. The pressure to hunt, to fill the barrels, to come home with a full ship was constant and unspoken. The Essex sailed south, rounded Cape Horn at the tip of South America, and pushed deep into the Pacific. Months passed. Whales were hunted. Oil was collected. The work was brutal and unglamorous, long stretches of tedium broken by explosive, dangerous bursts of violence. A sperm whale can reach 60 feet in length and weigh 50 tons. Killing one from a small wooden rowboat with handheld harpoons was not sport. It was organized chaos with a reasonable chance of death. By November 2020, the Essex was roughly 2,000 miles west of South America, deep in the equatorial Pacific. The crew had been at sea for over a year. The hold was partially full. They needed more whales. On the morning of November 20th, the lookout spotted a pod. The small hunting boats were lowered. The men took up their oars. The hunt began in the usual way, quietly, carefully, with the specific tension of men who know exactly how dangerous what they're about to do really is. And then something happened that none of them had ever seen. Something that, as far as the historical record shows, had never happened before in the entire history of American whaling. One of the whales turned around. He was enormous, 85 feet long by some estimates, a bull sperm whale, the largest animal any of them had ever encountered. He had been observed at the surface, behaving strangely, moving in slow circles, appearing agitated in a way that experienced whalers could not explain. Owen Chase, back aboard the Essex managing repairs to one of the hunting boats, watched from the deck as the whale suddenly oriented itself toward the ship. It began to move, not drifting, not swimming, charging. It struck the Essex head-on. The impact was described by Owen Chase as feeling like the ship had hit a rock. The hull shuddered. Men were thrown from their feet. Water began flooding the lower decks immediately. Before anyone could fully process what had just happened, the whale surfaced, circled, and charged again. The second strike was worse than the first. It hit the bow with enough force to open the hull further, and this time there was no question about what was happening. The Essex was sinking. Chase would later write that he stood on the deck in a kind of stunned silence, watching the ship settle into the water, unable to fully believe what his eyes were telling him. The whale had disappeared. The hunting boats were scattered across the water. The men who had been aboard the Essex scrambled for anything that floated. Within an hour and a half, the ship was gone. They were 20 men, 3 small whaleboats, coordinates roughly 0 degrees latitude, 119 degrees west longitude. The nearest land, the Marquesas Islands, lay approximately 1,200 miles to the west. The coast of South America lay nearly 2,000 miles to the east. They had managed to salvage some hardtack, some tools, some navigational equipment, and a small amount of fresh water before the Essex went under. It was not enough. And Captain Pollard, staring at the open ocean in every direction, had to make the first of several decisions that would define and destroy the next 3 months of their lives. He chose not to sail west toward the Marquesas. The reason he gave would seem reasonable on the surface, and it would lead directly to everything that followed. The Marquesas were closer. Every experienced navigator in those 3 small boats understood that. Sailing west made logical sense. It offered the fastest route to land, to food, to survival. Pollard proposed it. Owen Chase agreed, and then one of the other men, the specific identity is debated by historians, raised a concern that overrode all navigational logic. The Marquesas, they said, were inhabited by cannibals. It was a fear rooted partly in rumor, partly in the particular terror that the word itself carried in 1820. The irony of that fear, of what they were sailing away from in order to avoid, would only become clear later, much later, when it was far too late. Instead, Pollard set a course southeast, toward the coast of South America. It was the longer route, far longer. It required sailing through a section of the Pacific largely devoid of wind, a region sailors called the doldrums, where ships could sit motionless for days while the sun burned down without mercy. They had perhaps 2 weeks of food and water if rationed carefully. South America was 2 months away. The mathematics were not hard to understand. What was hard was accepting what those mathematics implied. The first weeks were grim but survivable. Rations were cut. Men grew thinner. The sun was merciless, and the boats offered almost no shade. Fresh water became an obsession. They collected what little rain fell and measured it in spoonfuls. Lips cracked, skin blistered. The ocean surrounded them in every direction, vast and completely indifferent. By late December, a small island appeared, Henderson Island, an uninhabited coral atoll. They landed, found fresh water, found birds and crabs they could eat. For a brief moment, it seemed like salvation. 3 men chose to stay behind, deciding that the island offered better odds than the continuing voyage. Pollard let them go. He resupplied as best he could, and the 3 remaining boats pushed back out to sea. The food ran out faster than expected. The water that had seemed adequate became insufficient almost immediately under the equatorial sun. Men began to die. The first death came on January 10, 1921. A sailor named Matthew Joy, already weakened before the wreck, simply could not hold on. He was buried at sea, or rather, he was placed into the ocean, which is a different thing entirely, a distinction that becomes important when you understand what came immediately after. Because once the first man died, Pollard and Chase and the surviving crew faced a question that no survival manual of the era addressed directly, a question that the word starvation makes abstract until you are actually living inside it. What do you do with the body? The answer they arrived at, the answer that history has judged them for, did not come immediately. It came gradually, the way all unthinkable things come, through a slow erosion of the boundary between what a person believes they are capable of and what hunger, desperation, and the will to survive will eventually demand. In their case, they consumed the dead. It began with Matthew Joy. It would not end there. And somewhere in the second boat, drifting slightly apart from Pollard's, Owen Chase was watching his own men weaken and trying to hold on to the belief that land was still coming, that the mathematics could still work out, that the thing that had already happened in the other boat would not become necessary in his. He was wrong. By late January 1821, the 3 boats had separated in the night. Chase's boat was alone. Pollard's boat was alone. The third, commanded by a man named Benjamin Lawrence, drifted somewhere between them, its crew reduced to barely functional. What happened in these boats over the following weeks exists primarily through 2 accounts. Owen Chase's narrative, published in 1821, and the recollections of Captain Pollard, recorded years later by writer Nathaniel Philbrick. The accounts are honest in their own way, which is to say they are honest about the facts while being carefully quiet about the interior experience of those facts. Chase lost men. He made the same calculation the others had made. He survived. Pollard's situation became something darker. By early February, Pollard's boat had been reduced to 4 men. Then the last of the salvaged food was gone entirely. Then the water. The sun continued its work. The ocean offered nothing. The men were skeletal, barely conscious, their bodies consuming themselves from the inside. One of the men in Pollard's boat was his young cousin, Owen Coffin, 17 years old. He had come on the voyage partly under Pollard's personal guarantee of safety, a promise the captain had made to the boy's mother before departure. When the decision was made, and accounts suggest it was made collectively by all 4 remaining men, that one of them would have to die so the others might survive, they drew lots. Owen Coffin drew the short straw. What followed is described in the historical record with a brevity that barely conceals the weight of it. Pollard reportedly offered to take his cousin's place. Coffin refused. He was killed by another crew member, Charles Ramsdell, who had drawn the lot of executioner. George Pollard ate his cousin to stay alive. He survived. He never fully recovered. Years later, on the anniversary of the Essex disaster, Pollard was reportedly found alone in his room, surrounded by food he had hoarded,
unable to stop eating even when full, a psychological response to starvation so total that it never entirely left him. He eventually became the night watchman of Nantucket, a quiet, solitary figure whom the islanders treated with a mixture of pity and unease. He never commanded another ship after his second vessel also wrecked, which is the kind of detail that seems almost cosmically excessive, but is true. Chase was rescued on February 18, 1821, by the British ship Indian. He and 2 other survivors from his boat were barely alive. Pollard and Ramsdell were found 4 days later by the ship Dauphin. The 2 men were sitting in their boat surrounded by the gnawed bones of their crewmates, bones they had reportedly refused to throw overboard, clinging to them the way people cling to the last evidence that the people they loved were real. 3 men, the ones who had stayed behind on Henderson Island, were rescued separately months later, having survived on the island in conditions nearly as desperate as those at sea. Of the 20 men who had left the Essex in 3 small boats, 8 survived.
The survivors came home to Nantucket in the spring of 1821. The story they brought with them landed on the island like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread quietly, carefully, through a community that depended on the whaling industry for its survival and had no interest in the kind of scrutiny this story invited. Owen Chase published his account of the disaster within months. It was detailed, navigational, precise, and strategically silent on certain elements. Chase was still a young man with a career to rebuild. He was careful about what he included and more careful about what he didn't. The survivors mostly didn't speak about it, not in any real way, not about the things that mattered. The Nantucket community absorbed them back with a kind of collective agreement to ask certain questions quietly and let others go unasked entirely. And yet, the story traveled. A young sailor named Herman Melville encountered one of the Essex survivors years later. Some accounts say it was Owen Chase's son who passed him a copy of the narrative. Others suggest direct conversation. What is documented is that Melville was shaken by it. He wrote about it in his journals with a kind of electric disturbance, the sensation of a story that had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't rationalize away. He spent years afterward writing Moby Dick, the white whale, the obsessed captain, the ship going down, the lone survivor clinging to a coffin in an empty ocean. It is a great novel. It is also, in some fundamental way, a processing of something true that was too uncomfortable to present as fact. The real story was more complicated than Melville's version and significantly less redemptive. There was no obsession, no grand tragic flaw, no Shakespearean hubris to explain why these men suffered. There was a whale that charged a ship. There was a captain who made a reasonable decision based on the information he had. There was starvation and mathematics and the specific gravity of choices made when every option available to you is a version of catastrophe. The Essex disaster resurfaced properly in the late 20th century, largely through Nathaniel Philbrick's book In the Heart of the Sea, which reconstructed the events from survivor accounts, historical records, and archaeological detail. The book won the National Book Award. It was later adapted into a film directed by Ron Howard. A new generation encountered the story and found it as disturbing and unresolvable as every previous generation had. Because the Essex doesn't offer resolution, it doesn't offer a moral, it doesn't tell you what kind of person you would have been in that boat, and it doesn't pretend to know either. What it offers is this: 20 men left a sinking ship. 8 came home. The distance between those two numbers is filled with decisions that are genuinely impossible to judge from the comfort of a world that has never asked that particular question of you. The whale that sank the Essex was never identified, never found, never explained. Sperm whales do not typically behave that way. Researchers have speculated about causes: a male defending territory, a whale responding to distress signals from the hunted pod, pure biological unpredictability. No explanation has ever been fully satisfying. Some things happen without reasons adequate to their consequences. The Essex sank. The men survived as long as they could, in the ways they could. The ocean kept no record of what it cost them. History kept a partial one. And somewhere at the bottom of the equatorial Pacific, 2,000 miles from the nearest coast, the wreck of the Essex still lies, undiscovered, uncatalogued, resting in water so deep that light has never reached it. Which is perhaps the most honest ending this story was ever going to get. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see something differently, you already know what to do. Like the video, subscribe, because the stories that history tried to bury are exactly the ones worth telling.